Hello and welcome to the final week of the Loft's virtual wordplay. My name is Caitlin Bolin and I am the individual giving director at the Loft. We're so glad you're here. We hope that during the challenges of COVID-19 that this little corner has been a place of respite and creative inspiration for you. As you may know, when we began planning wordplay, our intention was to have 100 authors and 10,000 visitors celebrating books in downtown East Minneapolis. Well, with a quick and thoughtful pivot, we have loved the opportunity to engage with you at home, bringing you conversations with today's top authors on conversation topics across the spectrum. Because you have shown up for us, we've reached over 40,000 viewers across the country. We are so grateful to provide all of our wordplay sessions to you free of charge, and that is due in large part thanks to the forward-thinking generosity and leadership of our sponsors, and especially our founding partners, St. Catherine University and Star Tribune. We would not be here without them. And while their support has gotten us this far, we turn to you, our dear virtual audience members, to bring us to the finish line. This week, as Minnesota raises funds as part of hashtag GiveAtHomeMN, and as we celebrate hashtag Giving Tuesday Now across the U.S., we ask you to please consider including the Loft in your giving plans. Your gift of any size allows readers and writers to continue to receive support through classes, fellowships, events, challenging conversations, and more, all at the Loft. And your donation will automatically make you one of our fantastic members. We hope you will support us as we support the literary community. Thank you for all you do for the Loft, and enjoy wordplay.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for this wordplay event. I'm Rachel Young, I work at the Loft Literary Center, and today I'm chatting with Mara Hvistendahl and Jan Stocklassa about their investigative narrative nonfiction books, The Scientist and the Spy, and The Man Who Played with Fire. I'll introduce these two in a second and we'll get started here, but I also wanted to take a second to thank our presenting sponsors, St. Catherine University and the Star Tribune, for making our wordplay festival possible. And you should see a link on your screen, if you're watching on Crowdcast, to purchase both of our authors' books today from our bookshop account, which I highly recommend that you do. And finally, we'll be taking audience questions at the end here. So at any point during this conversation, you should feel free to type your question into the comments section wherever you're watching. And if you're watching on Crowdcast, you can hit the Ask a Question button, and we'll get to those at the end. So Mara and Jan, I'll briefly introduce you both and then we'll dive in. Mara Hvistendahl is an investigative reporter at The Intercept and the author of The Scientist and the Spy, A True Story of China, the FBI, and Industrial Espionage. Her first book, Unnatural Selection, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the LA Times Book Prize, and was named Best Book of the Year by the Wall Street Journal, Slate, and Discover. Mara also authored the best-selling Kindle single, And the City Swallowed Them. For 8 years, she was based in Shanghai, where she was the China bureau chief for Science magazine. And Jan Stocklassa is a Swedish writer and journalist, focusing on large-scale affairs in international politics. His breakthrough came with critically acclaimed bestseller Stieg Larsson's Archive, The Key to the Palme Murder in 2018. Following its publication, Swedish police actively began pursuing the leads presented in the book in the assassination of Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme. And the book we're talking about today is also about this topic. His professional career comprises being a Swedish diplomat, launching the Metro newspaper in Prague, collaborating on national and international journalism ventures, and producing films including the documentary Stieg Larsson, The Man Who Played with Fire. Thank you both for joining us today.
Good to be here.
Thank you.
I'd just love to start by having each of you give a brief introduction to your books, which are both part investigative narrative nonfiction and part kind of spy thriller. So Mara, maybe you can start us off.
Sure. It's really good to be here with everybody virtually. My book is about a case involving an ethnic Chinese man who was found near a cornfield in Iowa in 2011. It was a Monsanto field where the company was growing next generation hybrid seed, and his appearance there set off a massive FBI investigation that spanned 2 years, involved the use of surveillance planes, a FISA warrant, which is typically reserved for extreme national security threats. There were airport busts. And so there were all these dramatic elements. And when I first read about this case, I wanted to know why so many resources had been devoted to this issue of trade secrets theft. And it became a way to tell this story of this broader shift of the FBI taking on intellectual property theft from China and technology issues, and the FBI's evolution from a law enforcement agency to a counterintelligence agency. So I told that broader story through this particular case involving a man named Robert Muehl.
Awesome. Jan?
Okay. Actually, the book that you mentioned, Stieg Larsson's Archive, is the same book that is called in English, The Man Who Played With Fire, or the Stieg Larsson's Lost Files and the Hunt for an Assassin. And it actually started some 6 years ago when I, through a line of coincidences, I found our crime writer, Stieg Larsson's Forgotten Archive, that after his death in 2004 was packed down into moving boxes. And I found it 10 years later. And I found out that he was actually investigating the murder of our Prime Minister, Olof Palme, in 1986, the unsolved murder of our Prime Minister. We call it the European JFK because there's so many theories and so many conspiracy theories around this. And it turned out that Stieg Larsson had his own theory, but he died before he could pursue it. So the book is actually about how I find his archive. I go through his papers and then start meeting the people that he would have met. And that took me not around the whole globe, but it took me to London, Cyprus, South Africa, the US, and a lot of other places. So it's written as a crime story and has been translated to 27 languages and published in something like 500,000 copies.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, both of these projects are clearly the work of just years of research and investigation. And I'm curious to know how these projects began for you. Like, what initially piqued your interest even before you began digging in? Did you have an interest in the broader topic that you ended up writing about, or was there one moment that you kind of started picking at and then realized that there was more to it? Maybe Jan, you can start with this one.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Actually, I wasn't interested in the Palme murder. I lived abroad for many years, so I missed most of it because it was before internet times. But then I was actually going to write another book about, that was very close to my summer house. There was a lady was found in 2008. She was murdered, killed. And I Googled the place where she was found. And then I found another murder in the same spot, but 170 years earlier, same farm. And I thought that was really intriguing. So I started looking for places where there had been double crimes. I'm an architect by education also, so these places are really, that's something special for me, a special topic for me. So, and then I found a few places. And the second place was one of the most famous murder places in Sweden. And through that, I found a suspect, a person that had been a real suspect in the murder of our Prime Minister. And that led me through this chain of coincidences, to the archive of Stieg Larsson. And only then I got really into the conspiracy theories and the murder of our Prime Minister and the politics behind that. That's how it started.
So something that kind of like organically unfolded for you. Interesting. Like it started out as a passion project and turned into a passion project of a totally different kind.
Yeah, I was pulled in rather than entering myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was living in China when I first read about the case of Robert Muehl. I was a journalist covering science there, and until then, that had been a relatively apolitical beat. but tensions between the United States and China were rising. They are now completely at a head in this, post-COVID moment. But back then we were seeing sort of the start of this trend. And because I'm from the Midwest, had grown up around cornfields, grown up in southern Minnesota, I just got fascinated by this story that kind of brought together this beat that I'd been covering for years with the place of my birth. And then there were just all these somewhat comical elements, and that initially is what drew me to it. That at some point, Robert Mo worked for a Beijing agricultural company and was trying to steal these genetically modified seeds on behalf of that company. So at one point, they actually tried to send seeds back to China in microwave popcorn bags, but then the FBI busted them at the airport, and there were these kind of low-speed car chases across the Midwest because everybody was driving really slowly. The suspects were looking for cornfields where they could go get ears of corn, and then the FBI was really trying hard not to reveal themselves because you have all this wide open Midwestern land where there aren't many trees. It's quite difficult to tail somebody. So that's when the FBI started getting out the surveillance planes, and this whole thing just really escalated on both sides. And when I moved back to Minnesota in 2015, it turned out that there had been quite a lot of discovery in court, which means that lawyers on both sides had fought it quite hard. And so there were just hundreds and hundreds of court documents, and the FBI had bugged the vehicles of the guys who worked for this Beijing company. So I had, actual conversations, like what they've been saying to each other in the cars. I had accounts of, there's one scene where an FBI agent is interrogating a woman who's connected to this Beijing company at LAX, the airport. And they end up kind of tearing her away from her children. And I had a play-by-play account of that conversation as well. And so there were just so many details in the documents that I realized that this would be a very colorful way to tell this story of rising tensions between the two countries and this flashpoint of technology and research, which now, at the time that I wrote it, I did not think that we would be at a point where we're kind of on the brink of conflict over essentially what's a science story. But looking back, I think you could see some of the seeds of that, no pun intended, in this case.
Interesting. It's interesting that you mentioned all the details and even the conversations that are recorded there. Reading both of your books, something that is really interesting that comes through, I think, a lot in narrative nonfiction like this is that these books have such a rich cast of characters. And I mean, sometimes you both even give us a window into their thoughts or perceptions or motivations, writing as though from their perspectives. And I'm curious to know that when you're writing long form nonfiction like this and you're building these characters, how do you build characters who are actually real people? And how do you ensure that, by writing a narrative that is designed to be, compelling, that you're not editorializing, and that it is, true to what happened while still being maybe the sort of unbelievably dramatic story that it actually is, if that makes sense.
Please.
Sorry, I should be assigning thoughts. Jan, first, if you feel prepared.
Yeah, okay, I'll go ahead. Let's not fight over this. My biggest challenge was actually Stieg Larsson, because he's dead. He's world famous. He sold, after his death, 100 million books. And he's a matter of a lot of conflicts actually over his inheritance, and there. So it's actually was a big challenge. And what I did was actually to meet with a lot of his friends, and also build a relationship with his live-in partner Eva Gabrielsson, who didn't get a single penny from the book sales, despite the fact that she spent 30 years with him, because they were not married. But through these conversations and through a lot of the documents that I had at my disposal, from the archive and from letters that I got from the friends, I got to know him quite well. I never met him, but I feel that I know him quite well. So Stieg Larsson was the big challenge. And then I have a number of other characters, including CIA Director William Casey at the time, or the master spy of South Africa, Craig Williamson, who confessed to a number of murders. And that's a guy that I met, actually, Craig Williamson. So he's a little bit easier to describe. But the people that are dead, then you have to rely on documents and tales from people that know them, and that's what I try to do at my best. And I try to describe it also in an afterword, where I describe how I've been dealing with the material and with the characters also, and the dialogues.
Yeah, something I guess I should say is that the first half of your book, Jan, is told more or less from the perspective of Stieg Larsson, kind of detailing like how he assembled this archive of like conspiratorial documents, that he was doing this kind of like on the side research into right-wing extremist groups in Sweden. Is how much I'm just curious to know, like, how much creative liberty did you take in kind of reimagining some of the scenes that you wrote for that half of it?
Definitely
you are taking yourself with this real person who has passed away.
Definitely, there's a certain amount of it, and that's what I describe in the afterword. But meetings that I describe, I know that they've happened. I know details of it. So there's, for instance, when he meets a journalist and he doesn't want to become the researcher for that book. But in the end, Eva Gabrielsson comes with the solution to how they can actually work together without naming Stieg Larsson as the researcher, for instance. That dialogue, I know in detail that it happened, but I don't know the exact words because nobody remembers it. But that's an example of how I tried to build situations that I knew about, but make them in my head how they work. And I think that's actually almost as close to the truth than any a non-fiction book, where it's always the picture is always from an angle of the writer or the journalist who actually chooses what was he's telling. So I think it's just as honest as a regular non-fiction book.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wrote a similar afterword because I also, had drawn from all these different sources. And then, on the one hand, I had the dialogue from the court papers and from the FBI's documents. And then I did also, there are 3 protagonists in my book. One is Robert Moe, the man who was found in the cornfield. Another is the lead FBI agent on the case, Mark Benton. And the third man was this Illinois farmer and seed breeder who was kind of caught in the middle. So, I found him 2 years into my research, really just by knocking on people's doors, the names of people I'd found in the court documents. And he had been hired to work for this Beijing company as a consultant, but had no knowledge of the kind of more nefarious plan. And then the FBI got to him and turned him into an informant. So I did pretty extensive interviews with these 3 people. The limitation with Robert Moe is that he, at that point, was in prison. And so for months, we just emailed using the prison email system. I had suggested phone calls, but, there's a 10-minute limit and so forth, and he just didn't feel as comfortable with that. And so at first he did not want to talk about any of the action in the case. You know, he didn't want to answer questions about, he had pleaded guilty by that point, but he did not want to talk about what had happened. So for months we talked about his childhood, what it was like when he first moved to America. He first came in the 1990s, and he has a family here, and all of that. And that actually was quite helpful in describing him as a character and helping the reader empathize with him, because ultimately I didn't want to have flat characters where you feel like, oh, the government guy is good and then this perpetrator is bad. I wanted them to be really all more complex. And as time went on, I also realized that there were some key similarities between Robert and Kevin, this farmer, who, in some ways they were both trained as scientists. They both had this very kind of exact way of approaching life, and in some ways were both caught up in this operation that was much larger than themselves, that they had not planned to get involved with. So I tried to play into some of that and come up with a rounder portrait of the characters. And that's something that you can really do in a book in a way that you can't, for example, in a magazine article, which I often write.
Yeah, I'm actually curious to know, for both of you, when did you know that you had a book on your hands instead of maybe like a collection of articles? Was it the amount of information that you were digging up, or was it more, like you're saying, Mara, that desire to go more in depth in developing characters?
So I initially thought that this case would be a nice article, and then I realized there were many other cases that involving like equally benign technologies, and there was this trend that started in the late aughts, and it's really continued and accelerated until today, where you just have case after case involving often ethnic Chinese scientists or scientists who have worked in China being brought. And so, trade secrets theft and economic espionage is now one of the top counterintelligence priorities of the FBI, and it had really gone unexamined. And so I thought that there would be a book in kind of looking more broadly at these cases. My first book was a kind of broad idea book, and I kind of initially hoped to do the same thing with this one. But then I kept getting drawn back to the corn seed case because it was so colorful, and at the point that I was living in Minnesota, it was then really like right in my backyard, and easy for me to go out and report and push a lot further than previous coverage had done. And so that's how it developed.
Yeah, and when I found the archive of Stieg Larsson, I don't think anybody could resist actually started going after the truth of this, and I went really far actually. Towards the end of the book, there are undercover operations, and there are connections to the CIA and the Cold War, and a lot of stuff actually that I hope is actually thrilling to read also. But it took quite a while before I actually wanted to write the book. Because I just wanted to just know more about this topic. I think that the moment was actually when our chief prosecutor, the DA, whatever you would call him, stepped out and said, it wasn't the person that we have said for 30 years killed our prime minister. That's bollocks. It's not true. We're looking at something completely different, and most likely a conspiracy. And that happened 3 or 4 years ago. And when I realized that I believed in something else, and now suddenly the authorities said we were wrong all the time, that triggered me even more. So I went even further, and I actually started writing the book, and it was published. It's 1.5 years ago for the first time. And in the foreword I write, I believe that the truth we will know the truth within 1 or 2 years. And then I handed in the book and all my materials actually. And as a strike of luck, within 2 months now, the same guy the chief prosecutor, has said that he will present the solution to the murder after 34 years. So before the end of June, we will know who killed our prime minister. And I believe that it will be very close to what Stieg Larsson believed already 30 years ago, when he was handing in material to the police several times, and they just said, okay, this is interesting, and went in another direction. 3 decades later, I think they will be on the right. They will present the solution that Stieg Larsson told them then.
I'm just curious, did they come to you for your research? Like, did the authorities or the investigators come to you and ask you about all your research?
No, they didn't. I met them through the years. I met them quite a few times.
Yeah.
And the first time when I came with the book and I came with the supporting materials, they were like, sort of, no, we know this. We know this. We know where we're going and everything. And then, but then they started reacting, and then they came back, and then actually they asked to get the book. So it's been handing in as evidence to the police, and then we met quite a few times, and then they acted against the suspect immediately, just before the book was published, actually a few days before it was published. So they were reluctant. They were acting like any police in an American movie would do.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, this is interesting to me, is that you yourselves, both of you, also become more or less characters in these stories as kind of the intermediator, the researcher, the investigator. I'm wondering if you can talk about that experience of how and when you choose to include yourself as a character in the story when you're writing narrative nonfiction. So Jan, like when you were doing this research, and even as you were writing and as you were researching, meeting with authorities, how did you choose when you were going to include information like that in the narrative that you ended up writing?
I was struggling quite a lot before I realized how I would structure the story, because I had the big problem that Stieg Larsson was dead, and he was the protagonist for the first half, as you said. And it's like, also you've seen some of these movies where suddenly the protagonist dies halfway and it's impossible to solve. And I had my Deus Ex Machina was actually to add myself into the mix. That was the only way. So afterwards I realized I become Michael Blomkvist, and I even found a young woman who meets the possible murderer, who becomes Lisbeth Salander, the heroine of Stieg Larsson. And she's much more brave than I am in real life. And she actually met with him and did these secret recordings that you read about. So that was the way how I structured it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also initially was going to write the book in the third person. I generally believe you have to have a pretty good reason to put yourself in a book. And then, I'd started out just telling the story of the FBI shift to taking on these technology theft cases, but that brought up all these other themes. There are a lot of people in the Asian American community who felt like they were being targeted unfairly. There were cases of scientists who were arrested who turned out to be innocent. In the case that I looked at, Robert Moe did steal corn from fields, but there was the question of whether the scope of the investigation and the punishment was commensurate with the crime, whether someone should go to federal prison for many years for stealing corn. And so these questions were all kind of swirling around this issue, and that got me into the history of how the FBI has viewed cases involving Chinese scientists. There's a long history. Many people remember the case of Wen Ho Lee in the late 1990s. So then I had these historical threads, and and my other general rule is a fairly obvious one, which is not to break chronology unless you absolutely need to. So then I realized, I think I realized by reading The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot. That's a book where she weaves these three different storylines and one is a historical storyline. And I realized that I could do the same thing by inserting myself into that historical storyline. So the first person comes up only in certain chapters and only in this one thread that's woven throughout the book. And then the chapters that are set more in the present day, those are told primarily in the third person. So it was a way of kind of signaling, like, now we're going into this more historical and context-rich chapter, and hopefully that's a way of like keeping the narrative very engaging. And it worked so well in The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, so I have to admit that I really borrowed that structure for my book.
It works for you too. It
what?
It really does. It works.
You can't plagiarize structure.
Yeah, right. It's a tool. One question I have for both of you, and maybe our last question before we move to some questions from our audience, is, the stories that you're telling here, both like the seed story that gets us started, and then the broader story that it grows into, with these like larger themes around international interests, politics, and corruption. It's making some pretty huge statements about, the historical record and about international relations, and how either historical events or current events get remembered or codified or thought about as they shape national memory or relationships between nations. I'm wondering if you can each talk a bit about how media, whether that's news media, films, fiction, or long-form stories like this, how media and producing media shapes the historical record, and how you think of your work in that context, maybe as challenging dominant narratives or shedding light on unspoken truths, and what is the role of media and the responsibility of media makers in that framework. Jan, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can start. I'm writing my next book now, and it's more conspiracies, events connected to the same period of time, and I believe that I think nobody said that the U.S. won the Cold War. We're happy in Sweden, at least, that we didn't get Soviet Union here, but there's some quite dirty dealings in that time period, the last years, from the 1980, Ronald Reagan becoming president, Senior Bush, and William Casey, CIA director, and that gang, actually, they did quite a lot of dirty dealings all around the world. And one piece in that puzzle is also the media, who actually managed or helped, at least assisted them in keeping things secret. And some of the major media in the U.S., if you check about the drug war and everything, how that happened, and I think that's a dark chapter in American media, at least. And I'm digging quite deeply into that now for my next book. It helped to win the Cold War, but I will tell some stories how actually the media are actually interacting. You may know Gary Webb, for instance, who broke the story about the cocaine war, and it was actually really badly treated by the major media. So I think that it's an enormous responsibility for the media, and we can do a lot of good, but there are time periods when the media is misused, actually. For certain interests, and I think it's a really, really important role to keep neutral and do what you're convinced is the truth in that sense.
I mean, that's completely true now as well, and of course after 9/11, with reports on weapons of mass destruction, it's a fairly well-known story. But now, being a reporter who focuses on China and technology. There's leak after leak coming from the State Department, and many of them are self-interested. For months, I think reporters are becoming much more savvy about it, but for months, like for example with technology theft, you would see press reports where people would just kind of report the US government's line without a lot of context or analysis. And I think especially right now, as we're on the brink of conflict, or as we are also in the midst of a global pandemic where cooperation could be critical, we have to be extremely careful about how we parse government information. But at the same time, to some degree, you're never sure what the end result of a story will be. And we can, I think you're right, Jan, that the duty of the press is primarily to try to get at the truth, because, for example, my first book dealt with sex-selective abortion and the impact of having many more boys born than girls. I tried to approach it from a feminist angle. It wasn't. I looked at how women's bodies had been abused over decades. It was primarily not a book arguing to ban abortion by any means. Certainly some people tried to use it for that, to that effect. But, it also hopefully brought more attention to this issue of sex selection and more protections for girls in certain countries. So it is ultimately kind of hard to predict what the end effect of a work could be, and it must be similar with a murder investigation as well.
Yeah, it can be misused.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, great, thank you so much. We do have a few questions from our audience. I'm going to pivot over to answer some of those. Our first one is from Maddie. Who says, these authors both did a lot of research and had a lot of information and documents to sort through. How did you move from all your research gathering to crafting and putting together a story? And how did you choose which information to keep and which to discard? Maybe Mara, you can start.
It's been quite a long time first reading all the court documents in the case. It's at the heart of my book. I was coming into the case relatively late, so I was able to be there for some of the court proceedings, but not all of them. And it didn't go to trial, but it did drag out in court for some time before it was settled. So I started by reading all the documents, then I assembled this big master timeline. And then I layered both these small events from the case with big geopolitical events. And so I inserted those in the timeline as well to kind of, so that as I was writing, I could give both a sense of what's going on in the world and what's happening in the case, and sort of position that within this bigger framework. The other element when you're trying to write a book that is narrative nonfiction is you go and find what the weather is on that day. So you have it, say you have a specific day, September 7th, 2011, the day when the action in my book started. You go and find out what was the weather, what was going on in this town, what was going on in this case, and then what was going on in the world. And so in my book, because it was primarily chronological, that timeline became a really critical tool.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. Actually, it was a struggle for me. Stieg Larsson, our crime writer, he was the eternal researcher. So when he had a finished book script, actually, he continued to add with his miniature handwriting into this finished manuscript, actually. So he had a real problem actually publishing, and I think his novels became his way of publishing. He could publish sort of his truth in that sense. and I had a problem before I didn't know how to get around to the story. I think it was actually when the book contract started to come. I got the first one, and I said, "Oh, I got a deadline of 11 months. Now I need to start writing." And then I got a second contract, and then I got another one, and then suddenly I had 20 book contracts, book publishers around the world that were waiting for my book, and I realized now I have to start writing. So then it was actually the push from outside that made it possible for me to get this, just to actually start working and sorting all the material into the right boxes and killing all the darlings that I had on the way there. So the big whip is the thing that works the best for me.
Nice, yeah. Sometimes it helps to be watched and waited upon. We have a question from DB in regards to Jan's comment about the media. I think this is about the media having been spun in hindsight, or used, like news media being used for purposes that it was not intended for. What should the media or media makers be doing to stop itself from being used that way? Also, among some media organizations, there seems to be a willful blindness to the fact that they're being used, or I think spun, to a different end. Why would that be?
Yeah, well, I must say that the period that I'm writing about it's special, and I can't say that it's valid nowadays. But if you read about it, you actually see that there were people very closely connected to the CIA working for some of your biggest titles. And I don't want to name the names now, but because I may name the wrong ones. But they're some of the biggest media houses and people in high positions, and that has been proven. So that's one thing to start with, to see that you don't have any people actually working for security services. That's a good start. We had the similar problems in Sweden, so it's not limited to the US in any way. But then that's only where it starts, and I believe that it's very obvious when you watch American media that how biased it is. If you watch Fox or CNN, and that completely different truths, and it's so it's a little bit strange to see that it's so biased, that there's so big difference, because we have political media also, but it's never this huge opposite truth that you see when you watch your media. And I'm not an expert on US media, but I'm trying to learn a lot. So maybe in a couple of years, when I publish my next book, I will be in better shape to answer the question, I hope.
Mara, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I do think, for example, that lessons were learned from the weapons of mass destruction issue, and that, if I look at some of the flashpoints in the COVID reporting, it seems that reporters are being a lot more cautious because they don't want to repeat this, giving an administration a justification to go into another country and so forth. So, for example, some of the reporting on the theory that COVID escaped from a lab, that is a lot more cautious than some of the reporting after 9/11 was. And, so I do think that those lessons are learned. This trend toward kind of echo chamber effect, where we get a very liberal pole of media and a very conservative pole, that that's partly an effect of the world that we live in, the technology that we're using, and the algorithms that shape our lives. And that's something that has certainly accelerated over the past 10 years. And I think will probably continue to accelerate unless we can somehow correct the algorithms, because Facebook is, for example, is and YouTube are set to show you more of what you like, and that is the way that our media landscape works. To some degree, I think it's a factor of the United States being a relatively large and diverse country that our poles are so far apart in media.
It's possible. Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned the weapons of mass destruction, because only a couple of months ago I met Hans Blix, the weapons inspector, who actually said, no, there are no weapons. To 99%, we're sure there are no weapons of mass destruction. He lives 3 blocks down here, and he's 91 or 92 years old.
Oh.
And he's cleaning up for death, as he says now. So my daughter is a documentary filmmaker, and she's filming interviews with him. Not at the moment because of the COVID situation, but
wow.
But it shows how small Sweden is, and it's not a very diverse country in that sense. But we have Hans Blix, and he told the truth. Yeah.
Interesting.
Interesting. Thank you. Another question here from Abby, who wants to know from both of you, what are you working on now? What's next? And how has your investigative work changed in this time of sheltering in place? Mara?
Sure. Well, I'm now doing investigative journalism for The Intercept, which means a lot of COVID coverage and articles that I can get out more quickly than a book. Because I've reported on tech for a number of years, I've gotten used to doing remote work. And so that part isn't such an adjustment for me. And also I think just in general, writers and freelancers who work from home are like particularly well suited to social distancing. It's something that we're doing like day in and day out when we write a book. So really not a huge imposition. But I'm hoping to go deeper on these abrupt changes to our lives, to geopolitics and so forth that have been wrought by the pandemic.
And I'm writing on a close associate of our Prime Minister Olof Palme, Mr. Bernd Carlson, who was the Deputy Secretary General of the UN. On the 21st of December, he was flying from London to New York to sign the independence of Namibia, and he was the commissioner for Namibia also, and he was going to sign for the UN, and he wasn't supposed to be on the Pan Am 103 that was blown up over Lockerbie. So he was lured onto that plane, and I'm writing on why was he on the plane, and I was quite fascinated by the fact that on the 11th of March, the Scottish Criminal Review Commission published a report saying that the only person was convicted, the Libyan Al-Megrahi. The evidence doesn't hold. His family, he's dead now, but his family has actually got the right for a new court proceeding. So he's probably innocent. So it wasn't Libya, it was something else. And that's what I'm writing about. Yeah. And that's official. So it's yeah.
Oh, great. I do have one final question for both of you. Something that I thought about while I was reading your books, but also just during this conversation, is that, all of the research that goes into a book like this can feel so like conspiratorial in itself, and does feel kind of like this snowball effect of like you open one file and it leads to another thing and it leads to another thing, and maybe soon you find yourself like, I don't know, like with a map of like threads going from person to person to location up on your wall. When you're writing, how do you kind of strike that balance, or when you're researching, how do you strike the balance between doing this really like dogged investigative work and making sure that you're not going like down a rabbit hole or like seeing what you want to see because you're following a hunch?
Well, I went down a number of rabbit holes with this book, but some of them were fruitful. So part of the reason I inserted this historical thread into The Scientist and the Spy is because I had been interviewing families of ethnic Chinese scientists who had had contact with the FBI or the CIA over the years. And a number of them said to me that, their relatives had mysteriously lost their jobs or been tailed by the FBI in the 70s and the 80s. And they suspected that there was a dedicated program attached to that. So fairly early on in my reporting, I placed a Freedom of Information Act request for documents connected to such a program, and then almost forgot about it. And then 2 years later, I did get a batch of documents that showed that such a program did exist. It had started in the J. Edgar Hoover years, so not a lot that happened under Hoover is surprising. This is a time when Martin Luther King was under surveillance, and so at the same time, it is important to tell that story, to show that this was not in people's imaginations and that this is not a conspiracy theory, because of that history should inform how investigations are conducted today and what framework the FBI uses to view the targets of its work and of its investigations. So that was one rabbit hole that ended up being fruitful.
Yeah,
Nice.
I'm mixing metaphors. Sorry, not fruitful. But
I agree with Mara. You have to go down the rabbit holes, and at the same time, as Rachel, you say you have to stay sane, and that's the balance. And it's hard to know when you're sane. So I've got sort of a guideline for myself, and that's never to spend more than 10 years on a conspiracy, because I've seen on the people that are actually dealing with the Palmer murder, and we have quite a few that have been spending 3 decades, 2 decades, or 3 decades on it, and they're really clever men usually, really clever, but they get all these really strange ideas after 2 or 2.5 decades. So the 1 decade, I think, is the timeline. And I'm happy now that we'll know the truth for the first one, and I'm switching to the next one. So I got a few years on this one. And then...
That's a pretty long time frame.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. Maybe I'm crazy already. Yeah.
I guess it's all relative. 10 years feels generous, but I feel we can be generous with ourselves. I like it. Well, thank you both so much for joining us for this conversation. This has just been such a treat. For those of you watching at home, thanks for tuning in. And you can buy both of our authors' books by clicking the button below here if you're watching on Crowdcast. You can also visit our website for a link to purchase these books. And please do. Our Wordplay Festival, which you're tuned into right now, is just one of the many, many programs that we offer for readers and writers year-round. And in fact, you can visit our website, which is loft.org, to take a peek at the virtual creative writing classes that we have coming up this summer for both kids and for adults. And many of these programs are made possible thanks to the generosity of our literary community. So if you're able, please do consider making a gift to support arts programs through the Loft year-round. There should be a link on your screen to do that too. And today, actually, we have a donor matching gifts up to $1,000, and I think we're currently, I don't know. I've gotten a few texts from Caitlin during this who's told me where we're at. We're pretty close. We don't need very much more to make it to our goal. So please consider giving if you're able. And thanks again so much for joining us. Thanks to our presenting sponsors, St. Catherine University and the Star Tribune, and to our authors. This has been great.
Thank you.
Thank you.